Picture this: a castle that has stood for centuries, its stones whispering secrets of kings and commoners alike, now surrendering to the weight of time. Not to the clash of swords or the roar of cannons, but to something far more insidious: the slow, relentless march of change. For the families who called these walls home, the loss isn't just about bricks and mortar. It's about the unraveling of a legacy, the fading of a story that was supposed to endure. What does it feel like to watch the heart of your history crumble? To stand in the shadow of what was once your birthright, knowing it can never be reclaimed. This is the emotional aftermath of losing a castle, a grief that's as personal as it is profound. These stories of displacement aren't just tales of fallen fortresses. They're windows into the human soul, revealing how deeply we're tied to the places that shape us. A castle isn't just a building. It's a living chronicle of triumphs and tragedies, of generations who laughed, loved, and fought within its halls. When it's gone, something more than stone is lost. The very fabric of identity begins to fray. Families grapple with questions that echo through time. Who are we without the walls that defined us? How do we carry forward a legacy that no longer has a physical anchor? The answers are as varied as the people who search for them, but one thread connects them all: the resilience of the human spirit in the face of irrevocable change. Today, we're stepping into these intimate narratives, tracing the emotional ripples of losing a home that was also a symbol of history. We'll meet those who have felt the weight of this loss not just as a personal tragedy, but as a cultural reckoning. From the quiet sorrow of a descendant sifting through ruins to the fierce determination of communities fighting to preserve what remains, these stories will challenge you to see castles not as relics of the past, but as living testaments to the people who cherished them. This isn't just a journey through history. It's an exploration of what it means to belong, to remember, and to rebuild when the foundations of your world have turned to dust. So settle in, because what you're about to hear will stay with you long after the final stone has fallen. To understand the full weight of losing a castle, we must first grasp what these towering structures truly represented in medieval life. Far more than military strongholds, castles were the beating hearts of entire worlds, physical manifestations of a family's past, present, and future. For the nobility, every stone was a chapter in their lineage's story. The great hall echoed with ancestral voices, the chapel held generations of whispered prayers, and the walls bore the scars of battles that shaped their name. Losing a castle wasn't just a tactical defeat. It was like having the roots of your family tree violently torn from the earth, but the pain rippled far beyond the Lord's chambers. For the villagers and craftsmen who lived in a castle's shadow, its presence meant safety, purpose, and order. The blacksmith knew his anvil would never go cold so long as knights needed swords. The baker's oven stayed warm, feeding the household. Even the lowliest farmer slept easier knowing those walls stood between his family and the chaos beyond. When a castle fell, it wasn't just a change of landlord, it was the collapse of an entire ecosystem. The social contract that bound lord to peasant, protector to protected, dissolved overnight. People who'd spent lifetimes knowing their place suddenly found themselves adrift in a world without landmarks. This dual loss of both personal legacy and communal stability created wounds that no treaty could heal. A noble family might mourn their heraldry fading from the banners, but the miller's daughter would grieve the sudden silence where castle bells once marked the hours. The emotional toll defied class distinctions, binding highborn and lowborn in shared disorientation. Historians often speak of castles as strategic assets, but rarely do we acknowledge them as emotional keystones, the invisible glue holding together individual identities and collective memory. When that keystone crumbled, people didn't just lose shelter, they lost the compass that had guided their lives for generations. Perhaps this explains why some displaced families clung so desperately to fragments, a salvaged tapestry, a single carved stone from the ruins. These weren't mere keepsakes, but lifelines to a world that no longer existed. In their hands, even the smallest relic became a vessel for everything the castle had once embodied: belonging, continuity, and the unspoken promise that some things were built to last. The cruel irony: while wars could strip away lands and titles, no conqueror could ever truly seize those intangible bonds, which is precisely what made their absence so devastating. The real tragedy of a fallen castle wasn't just the destruction of a building, but the unmooring of countless souls who'd anchored their lives to its story. When we think of fallen castles, our minds often leap to dramatic scenes: flaming arrows arcing over battlements, siege engines pounding at gates, the clash of steel as invaders storm the walls. But history whispers a quieter truth. Most castles didn't meet their end in fire and blood. They faded slowly, victims not of conquest, but of the relentless grind of time and circumstance. The real story of displacement is written in crumbling ledgers, whispered in court intrigues, and etched into stones weathered by neglect. Take financial ruin, the silent killer of dynasties. Maintaining a castle was staggeringly expensive. The cost of garrisoning soldiers, repairing walls after every storm, and hosting the endless stream of noble guests could drain even the deepest coffers. Many families found themselves trapped in a cruel paradox. Their castle, the very symbol of their power, became the anchor dragging them into debt. When the money ran out, roofs caved in, gates rusted shut, and slowly, inevitably, the lifeblood of the household seeped away. No enemy army needed to storm the gates when bankruptcy did the job just as thoroughly. Then there were the political winds, shifting like a treacherous tide. A lord who backed the wrong claimant in a royal succession might return home to find his lands confiscated by the new king. Others fell victim to inheritance disputes, siblings squabbling over their birthright until the courts intervened, carving up estates like a feast for vultures. And let's not forget the quiet brutality of royal policy. Kings often deliberately dismantled castles to prevent rival nobles from becoming too powerful. What took generations to build could be reduced to rubble by a single royal decree. Nature itself conspired against these stone giants. Without constant care, moisture seeped into mortar, frost cracked towers, and ivy's relentless fingers pried apart the mightiest walls. Some castles simply outlived their usefulness. Strategic strongholds in one era became irrelevant in the next, left to crumble as trade routes shifted or borders moved. The land itself reclaimed them, grass sprouting through floorboards, birds nesting in arrow loops where sentries once stood watch. Perhaps the most poignant losses were the ones that happened without fanfare. No epic last stand, no ballads sung of their fall, just an empty chair in the great hall, a hearth gone cold, and the slow realization that no one would come to repair the cracks spreading across the family crest above the gate. These forgotten ends remind us that history isn't always written in bold strokes of war and glory. Sometimes it's etched in the quiet desperation of a ledger's final page, or in the way ivy embraces a broken tower, as if nature itself is offering a gentle elegy for what once was. The ink stains on these parchment letters tell a story no battle chronicle could capture, not of violence, but of slow, suffocating despair. Meet Lord Aldrich de Montfort, a 15th century nobleman whose family had ruled from the same castle for 300 years. His ancestors had weathered sieges, rebellions, even the plague, yet their fortress still stood proud against the horizon. But Aldrich's enemy couldn't be fought with swords. It came in the form of numbers columns of debt in his ledger growing taller each year, like shadows creeping across his family's legacy. His letters, preserved by some miracle of time, read like a whispered confession. The masons came today for the East Tower stones. He writes in one, the quill strokes trembling. I told my steward to pay them in wine so the men wouldn't see me weep. Piece by piece, his birthright was dismantled not by invaders, but by creditors carrying scrolls instead of siege engines. The castle's great hall, where his grandfather had hosted kings, became a hollow shell when the oak paneling was sold to a merchant from Flanders. The chapel's stained glass depicting his family's patron saint now lit some burgher's counting house. With each loss, Aldrich's letters grow more fragmented, as if the act of writing his own unraveling was too much to bear. What makes his plight so haunting is how familiar it feels. Strip away the velvet doublets and Latin legal terms, and you'll recognize the same dread in a modern family packing boxes after foreclosure. The way a home's disintegration mirrors the collapse of identity. Aldrich didn't just lose property, he lost the very script of his life. In one poignant passage, he describes arriving at a neighboring lord's feast, only to realize no one rose to greet him. Without his castle, he'd become invisible, a ghost of nobility in a world that measured worth by land and walls. Yet even in his despair, there are glimmers of something universal, the stubborn human need to preserve dignity amid ruin. His final letter, scribbled on a scrap of parchment, mentions planting an apple sapling in the abandoned courtyard. Perhaps the roots will remember what the stones cannot, he writes. It's a small, aching act of defiance. Centuries later, that tree still stands on the overgrown site, its gnarled branches a testament to the truth we often forget. Displacement isn't just about losing a place. It's about the silent war to keep belonging alive when everything that once defined it has turned to dust. History remembers the names of lords and ladies, but what of the hands that kneaded their bread, the voices that sang their children to sleep? When a castle fell, its collapse echoed loudest in the lives of those who never signed charters or sat at high tables. Take young Marguerite, a baker's daughter who spent her childhood in the warm glow of ovens beneath a northern castle's keep. Her story, passed down through generations in fragments of song and fireside tales, paints a portrait of displacement far removed from noble chronicles. For Marguerite, the castle wasn't just a place of work, it was the rhythm of life itself. Dawn began with the clatter of wooden peels sliding loaves into brick ovens, the scent of rye and honey curling up to the Lord's chambers. She knew which steps creaked on the servant's stair, which window caught the first light to warm her chilled fingers. Every festival, every birth, every death was marked by the bread she helped shape, braided loaves for weddings, summer barley rounds for funerals. When the castle's banners were lowered for the last time, it wasn't just a household dissolving, it was the sundering of 1,000 tiny threads that had woven her world together. The aftermath was a quiet apocalypse. Without the castle's demand for 20 loaves daily, her father's trade withered. The village, once bustling with carters bringing grain and merchants buying bread for the garrison, became a ghost of itself. Marguerite's family joined a stream of displaced servants, blacksmiths without armor to mend, laundresses without fine linens to scrub, all wandering the roads like pages torn from the same book. In one haunting oral history, she describes passing the ruined castle years later, spotting wild onions growing where the kitchen garden had been. We ate them raw, she recalls, and they tasted of dust and memory. What makes these accounts so vital is how they reframe our understanding of loss. While nobles lamented the fall of dynasties, the servant class grieved the death of something subtler, purpose. A steward who'd spent 40 years memorizing every barrel in the cellar now had no cellar to tend. A groom who could recognize each horse by its cough found himself adrift in a world that valued his skills no more. Their grief carried no heraldry, left no parchment trail, just the unbearable lightness of becoming unnecessary. Yet within Marguerite's story lies an unexpected resilience. She eventually settled near a monastery, trading bread for lessons in letters. The ledger that records her modest land purchase centuries ago bears a shaky signature proof that even the nameless could rebuild. Her legacy whispers a truth we often overlook. Castles didn't just house the powerful. They were ecosystems where every life, no matter how small, had its place in the story. And when the walls fell, that story didn't end. It simply scattered like seeds on the wind, taking root in ways no chronicler could have foreseen. A single thread from a moth-eaten tapestry, a cracked tile pried from the ruins, a yellowed parchment with a broken seal. These weren't just objects to the families who salvaged them. They were lifelines. In the wake of losing their castles, displaced nobles and servants alike clutched to fragments like sailors to driftwood, each relic a buoy against the tide of forgetting. Modern psychologists recognize this instinct instantly. It's the same urge that leads wildfire survivors to sift through ash for photo albums, or refugees to stitch precious jewels into hemlines. Trauma strips people bare, but memory clings to whatever solid things remain. Consider the Countess Eleonora of Provence, who reportedly carried a single carved oak panel from her ancestral hall through 20 years of exile. It wasn't the artistry she treasured, but the grooves worn by her grandfather's signet ring as he tapped it absently during council meetings. Every nick and scratch was a tactile echo of a world that no longer existed. Medieval scholars call these memory objects, physical anchors that kept identities from dissolving into the mist of displacement. Unlike official portraits or chronicles meant for public record, these intimate relics preserved the unspoken rhythms of daily life, the uneven floorboard that creaked near the buttery, the soot stain above the hearth where generations of cooks had leaned. Modern research sheds startling light on this behavior. Neurologists have found that handling objects tied to personal history activates the brain's sensory cortex more powerfully than simply recalling memories. That's why a displaced knight's descendant might keep a rusted hinge from the castle gate running a thumb over its pitted surface, literally helped his brain reconstruct lost sensations. The metallic groan of the portcullis rising, the way winter mornings made the iron frosty to the touch. These objects became portals, collapsing time between what was and what remained. But the most poignant relics were often the humblest. Archaeologists excavating ruined castles frequently find caches of domestic items, a chipped spoon buried beneath a collapsed wall, a child's leather shoe hidden in a crevice. These weren't treasures hidden from invaders, but quiet acts of defiance against oblivion. A servant tucking away a familiar bowl wasn't just saving a utensil, they were preserving proof that their hands had once belonged somewhere. The parallels to modern displacement are uncanny. Ask anyone who's fled a natural disaster or war zone, and they'll describe clutching strangely similar talismans, a doorknob from a childhood home, a brick from a demolished school. This universality suggests something profound about human resilience. When the walls fall, whether they're made of stone or drywall, we don't just mourn the structure. We scramble to salvage the invisible fingerprints left on every surface, the silent witnesses to lives that refuse to be erased. The weight of a cold hearthstone in your palm can be the difference between vanishing and remembering you existed at all. Perhaps that's why so many medieval wills meticulously list seemingly trivial items, not just lands and jewels, but a specific candlestick, a worn prayer cushion. These weren't just bequests, they were maps for future generations to navigate back to a home that no longer stood. In an age before photography, before video, these fragments became the only way to whisper across centuries, "We were here." The castle was real, remember us. The official chronicles of castle conquests read like victory laps, pages brimming with boasts about splintered gates and lowered banners, the ink practically glowing with triumph. But turn those stiff parchment leaves carefully, and you'll find the real story hiding in the margins, buried under the wax of broken seals. For every line praising a king's military genius, there were 100 unwritten tears, 1,000 silenced voices. The chronicler's quills skipped over the servant hiding in the wine cellar as soldiers ransacked her home, the stable boy who never spoke again after watching his beloved horses slaughtered. History, it seems, had little patience for grief when there were battle strategies to record. Yet the truth has a way of seeping through. Folk songs from the period, passed down orally through generations, carry echoes the chronicles ignored. There's a haunting Breton ballad about a weaver's wife who stitched the names of displaced families into a tapestry until her fingers bled. A German rhyming chronicle mentions, almost as an afterthought, how the scent of lavender lingered for weeks in a conquered castle's halls because the lady of the house had packed her chests with dried blossoms before fleeing. These aren't just poetic details, they're fractures in the official narrative, tiny windows into the emotional aftershocks that shook lives long after the last trumpet blast. Why were these stories erased? Partly because medieval chroniclers wrote for patrons' victorious lords who wanted their glory immortalized, not their victims' suffering. But there's something darker at work too. Acknowledging the human cost of conquest would have forced society to confront its own brutality. It's easier to celebrate a fallen castle as a tactical achievement than to dwell on the child asking why her doll had to be left behind in the escape. Trauma, then as now, was messy. It didn't fit neatly into the ledgers of power. Today, historians are piecing together these suppressed stories using unexpected sources. Kitchen inventories reveal sudden shortages of comfort foods like honeyed almonds in the months after displacement, clues to collective depression. Architectural surveys show where walls were hastily rebuilt, not for defense, but to block views of the ruins from certain chambers. Even skeletal remains tell tales. Forensic archaeologists note spikes in stress-related dental damage among populations near abandoned castles. Each fragment is a rebuttal to the triumphalist narratives, proof that for every conqueror's feast, there were countless sleepless nights on straw pallets in unfamiliar lands. The most revealing discoveries come from personal artifacts deemed too trivial for official records. A scrap of parchment found stuffed inside a prayer book in Bavaria contains a single sentence: "Today I forgot the sound of my mother's voice." No date, no signature, just this raw stab of loss preserved by chance. It's in these unguarded moments that we finally hear the voices chroniclers silenced. They remind us that history isn't just about who won or lost, but about the quiet devastation of those who never chose the battle in the first place. Recovering these stories isn't just an academic exercise. It's an act of justice, a way to restore dignity to lives reduced to footnotes. When we listen to the ballads, read between the lines of inventories, or hold a child's worn toy unearthed from a moat, we're doing more than studying the past. We're bearing witness, and in that act we honor a truth medieval chroniclers couldn't or wouldn't write, that every fallen castle was someone's home first, and its stones echo with absences no victory could ever fill. The wax seal on Lady Isabow de Clermont's final letter bears not her family crest, but the jagged imprint of a key pressured into service when her signet ring was confiscated. It's a small, defiant detail that encapsulates her extraordinary struggle. When her husband fell in battle during the War of the Breton Succession, Isabow didn't retreat to a nunnery as custom dictated. She barricaded herself in their castles solely with the household accounts and a determination that would make legal history. For 12 years, she fought kings, bishops, and her own brother-in-law for the right to keep what the law said wasn't hers to hold. Her surviving correspondence reads like a masterclass in strategic resistance. To the bishop who declared women unfit to command stone and mortar, she quoted scripture about the wise woman who rebuilt a city. When the king's men arrived with an eviction order, she had her steward serve them refreshments on silver plates, engraved with her lineage, a silent reminder that her bloodline predated the crown's claim. Each parchment she sent was meticulously drafted, leveraging every loophole in feudal law. One particularly brilliant appeal invoked an obscure statute granting widows of crusaders temporary custody of estates, never mind that her husband had died in a petty border skirmish, not the Holy Land. But Isabow's true legacy lies in what her letters reveal about the fragility of women's ties to place. Without a living husband or son, noblewomen existed in legal limbo, technically entitled to dower rights, but vulnerable to male relatives contesting those rights. Her castle wasn't just a home, it was the physical manifestation of her social worth. Losing it meant more than displacement, it meant erasure. In one heart-wrenching dispatch to her sister, she describes watching from a tower as her husband's cousins divided her tapestries like butchers portioning meat. "They measure my life in ells of cloth," she writes, the ink blotted where tears fell. The cruel irony, Isabow's legal acumen ultimately worked against her. After exhausting every appeal, her opponents resorted to branding her a witch, a fateful accusation that forced her flight to Burgundy. Yet even in exile, she weaponized memory. The inventory from her borrowed lodgings lists an astonishing item: a scale model of her lost castle, carved in walnut. Visitors reported finding her moving tiny figures across its miniature bailey, reminiscing scenes from her former life. Psychologists today might call this therapeutic repetition, but in medieval terms, it was something far more radical, a woman insisting her story mattered enough to recreate, even in miniature. What makes Isabow's ordeal so revelatory isn't just her defiance, but how her plight mirrors countless unnamed women's experiences. Recent archival discoveries suggest her case wasn't unique, just exceptionally well documented. Parish records across Europe hint at shadow histories of widows quietly contesting dispossession through means both ingenious and desperate. Some bribed scribes to alter inventories, others accidentally burned title deeds before surrendering estates. A handful even took vows as abbesses, transforming convents into fortresses of female autonomy. These fragmented stories force us to reconsider medieval displacement through a gendered lens, not just as the loss of land, but as the systematic unraveling of women's legal personhood. Isabow's final act of rebellion came in the form of a will composed on her deathbed in a foreign land. Against all convention, she left her miniature castle not to a male relative, but to her maid's daughter, that she may remember what women once held. That tiny model survives today in a Dijon museum, its wooden turrets worn smooth by centuries of reverent touches. Like the key pressed into wax, it stands as testament to a truth too often buried in the Chronicles, that castles weren't just lost in battles or bankruptcies. Sometimes they were stolen stitch by stitch from the hands of those society refused to see as guardians of history. The human mind has always struggled to make sense of sudden loss, whether it's a medieval lord watching his ancestral tapestries torn down or a modern family fleeing wildfire with only a carload of belongings. Recent breakthroughs in trauma psychology reveal startling parallels between medieval accounts of castle displacement and contemporary PTSD research. Those haunting descriptions of noblemen wandering their own ruined halls, touching stones as if expecting them to speak, they're not just poetic metaphors. They're textbook symptoms of what we now call complicated grief, where the loss isn't just personal but cultural, generational, even existential. Dr. Elena Vaughan, a historian specializing in medieval mental health, uncovered something extraordinary in monastery infirmary records. Following major castle seizures, nearby villages saw spikes in cases labeled melancholia, patients suffering insomnia, loss of appetite, and what one friar described as the mind's eye fixed upon absent towers. The symptoms mirror modern PTSD, but with a medieval twist. Many sufferers reported dreams where their lost castle appeared, distorted gatehouses upside down, familiar corridors leading nowhere. This phenomenon, known today as trauma-related dissociation, shows how deeply spatial memory is wired into our sense of self. When the physical markers of identity vanish, the mind struggles to reconcile past and present. The physical toll was equally devastating. Paleopathologists studying skeletons from displaced castle communities found alarming patterns: increased bone lesions from stress-induced inflammation, dental enamel defects suggesting periods of starvation, even higher rates of heart disease. One particularly poignant discovery was a mass grave near a 15th century French ruin, where several bodies showed signs of broken heart syndrome, a modern term for stress cardiomyopathy. These weren't battlefield casualties, but people who literally succumbed to the weight of their uprooted lives. What makes medieval displacement unique was the absence of psychological frameworks to process it. Modern trauma survivors might attend therapy or join support groups, but medieval people had only religious confession or folk remedies. Some turned to pilgrimages, walking endlessly as if movement could fill the void left by their stationary homes. Others channeled their grief into creative acts like the anonymous monk who spent years illuminating a manuscript with meticulous drawings of his abbey's destroyed cloisters. Art became his anchor, a way to reconstruct what war had taken. Perhaps most tragically, this trauma rippled through generations. Family chronicles revealed descendants still wrestling with the shadow of the fallen keep centuries later. One noble line developed a peculiar tradition. Each firstborn son was given a tiny silver replica of their ancestral castle to wear as a pendant, not as a status symbol, but as what we'd now call a transitional object, a tactile reminder of stability in a world that had proven fragile. Contemporary psychologists working with refugees note eerily similar coping mechanisms. A Syrian architect in exile builds scale models of Aleppo's bombed landmarks. A Ukrainian grandmother stitches her village layout into embroidery. These aren't coincidences, but evidence of a universal human response to displacement. The castle wasn't just stone and timber. It was the scaffold upon which people hung their memories, routines, and very sense of belonging. Its loss didn't just leave them homeless. It left them unmoored in time. This intersection of medieval and modern trauma studies offers something profound, not just insight into the past, but healing frameworks for the present. Recognizing historical displacement as psychological injury validates experiences too often dismissed as mere nostalgia. When a 14th century widow writes of her heart, cloven as the castle gate, or a modern evictee describes dreaming of their apartment's lost doorknob, they're speaking the same emotional language. The stones may differ, but the fracture lines run just as deep. Understanding this continuity reminds us that healing from loss, whether of castles or childhood homes, isn't about rebuilding walls, but rediscovering how to carry their imprint forward. The lute strings trembled like a dying man's last breath as the minstrel Henry of Lorraine sang of the fallen Chateau de Brevel. His ballad, scratched onto a scrap of vellum now preserved in a Paris archive, doesn't just describe the castle's destruction, it conjures the precise moment the last torch guttered out in the Great Hall. The shadows drank the light whole, he wrote, as if the very walls were swallowing their own history. For 30 years after the castle's siege, Henry wandered from tavern to marketplace, turning military triumph into lyrical elegy. His songs didn't just mourn stone and timber, they preserved the scent of rosemary from the kitchen gardens, the way the steward's laughter bounced off the vaulted ceilings, the particular squeak of the third step on the spiral stair. In a world without photographs, his music became a living portrait of loss. What made Henry's ballads revolutionary wasn't just their beauty, but their defiance. Noble patrons often paid minstrels to sing of glorious conquests, but Henry turned his verses into quiet rebellion. When the new lord of Bravel's lands demanded celebratory songs, Henry famously replied, "My tongue only knows truth, and truth wears mourning clothes." His refusal cost him patronage, but gained him something more precious: the trust of displaced servants, who whispered their memories to him under alehouse candlelight. A stable boy's recollection of the castle hounds howling during the final assault became the Ballad of Loyal Hearts. A laundress's grief over abandoned linens inspired the ghosts in the bleaching fields. Where Chronicles recorded battles, Henry's songs preserved the human echoes left behind. Modern folklorists have identified a remarkable pattern in these songs. Their melodies consistently use the ancient Dorian mode, a scale medieval listeners associated with resilience amid sorrow. This wasn't accidental. Henry's compositions weaponized musical memory, embedding sensory details in rising and falling phrases designed to lodge in listeners' bones. The descending fourth interval in The Siege of Bravel mimics the crash of falling masonry. The sudden silences in Lady Alea's Lament recreate the unbearable quiet after the last resident fled. These weren't just songs, they were emotional time capsules, ensuring future generations would feel the weight of what had been lost. The minstrel's greatest act of preservation may have been his most subtle. Hidden within his lyrics are precise descriptions of the castle's layout, not just the grand halls, but the servants' passages, the hidden alcoves where children played. Centuries later, when archaeologists excavated Bravel's ruins, they used Henry's ballads as a literal map. His description of the well where the maiden's shadow fell at noon led them to a buried courtyard. The cellar where the wine slept colder than winter revealed intact vaults beneath collapsed walls. In this way, his grief became a bridge across time, allowing fragments of the castle to be physically reclaimed long after memory had faded. Henry's legacy challenges how we think about historical preservation. While kings built monuments to their own glory, a penniless minstrel safeguarded something far more fragile: the texture of everyday life within those walls. His ballads remind us that castles weren't just political chess pieces, but ecosystems of human connection. When he sang of a scullery maid humming as she scrubbed pots, or a sentry sharing his last crust with a stray dog, he was resisting the erasure of ordinary lives. The stones may have been carted away for new construction, but Henry's music ensured the soul of the place couldn't be so easily dismantled. There's a poignant coda to his story. Near the end of his life, blind and frail, Henry was said to have whispered a final verse never written down. When the last voice forgets the tune, the castle truly falls. In that moment, he revealed the profound truth underlying all acts of remembrance. Physical ruins may crumble, but the stories we choose to carry forward determine what truly endures. Every time someone hums one of Henry's melodies today, whether in a concert hall or a countryside inn, they're not just recalling history. They're rebuilding the castle, note by note, in the only place it can never be conquered, the human heart. The first frost of winter glistened on broken arches as the widow Adela approached the ruins of Château de Montlehéry, not to reclaim it, but to trace her fingers along the same weathered stones where her children had once pressed sticky handprints. She was far from alone. Across medieval Europe, abandoned castles became silent gathering places for the displaced, their crumbling walls serving as the only remaining touchstones to vanished lives. Modern archaeologists call these visits emotional pilgrimages, journeys not to sacred sites, but to the skeletal remains of homes that still pulsed with memory long after their gates fell. Excavations reveal astonishing evidence of these quiet returns. Beneath collapsed gatehouses, teams have found deliberately placed objects. A child's wooden top wedged between foundation stones, a rusted key hung from a surviving hinge. At Dunstanburgh Castle in England, conservators discovered hundreds of shallow carvings on interior walls. Not the graffiti of invaders, but carefully incised initials, dates, and crude family crests. Some markings showed signs of being retraced annually, the grooves deepening with each grieving stroke. These weren't acts of vandalism, but desperate attempts to say, "I was here." This place knew me. The most poignant finds come from hidden niches, the architectural equivalent of kept secrets. Behind loose stones in a Normandy tower, archaeologists uncovered a bundle of rosemary sprigs tied with faded blue ribbon, still faintly fragrant after 5 centuries. In a Scottish stronghold's collapsed chapel, a hollow beneath the altar contained a single silver button and a lock of auburn hair wrapped in vellum inscribed Margaret, aged 12 summers. These weren't lost items, but deliberate deposits, physical prayers left in the bones of a building that had once sheltered entire worlds. What makes these discoveries so revealing is how they contradict official narratives of conquest. While chroniclers wrote of castles changing hands in neat ink strokes, the ruins themselves tell messier, more human stories. Soil analyses near certain sites show concentrated wear patterns not from armies or work crews, but from feet pacing the same path year after year. At Kenilworth, the packed earth near the kitchen ruins contained an unusual concentration of chamomile pollen, suggesting someone kept planting the herb long after the hearth went cold. Psychologists studying modern displacement note eerily similar behaviors, refugees returning to bombed neighborhoods to recover a single teacup, wildfire survivors sifting ashes for recognizable fragments. This compulsion to revisit and reclaim isn't about practicality. It's about reconstructing the mental maps that orient us in time and space. For medieval people, whose identities were literally tied to the land through feudal bonds, the physical act of touching ruins may have been a way to verify their own continued existence in a destabilized world. The ruins themselves became collaborators in this process of remembrance. Certain castles seem to have been modified by their conquerors in telling ways, not just dismantled for strategic reasons, but selectively preserved. At Conwy in Wales, English occupiers deliberately left the Welsh royal apartments intact while demolishing defensive walls, creating a sort of open-air museum of subjugation. Yet surviving records suggest displaced Welsh families still gathered there on saints' days, their songs in the roofless halls transforming a symbol of defeat into a vessel for cultural survival. Perhaps this explains why some ruins developed quasi-religious significance. Pilgrims began visiting the skeletal remains of Glastonbury Abbey, not to venerate saints, but to leave offerings for their own lost ancestors. Local legends spoke of the stones weeping on certain anniversaries, a phenomenon modern geologists attribute to seasonal moisture, but which medieval visitors interpreted as the building itself grieving. This blurring of architecture and emotion created landscapes where memory became geography, and every fallen arch whispered a name. The true power of these ruins lies in what they refuse to become: silent. Through carvings, hidden tokens, and the very wear of countless hands on stone, the displaced ensured their castles never fully transitioned from homes to historical sites. Even in decay, the walls bore witness not to who won or lost, but to all the small, stubborn acts of love that outlast both conquest and time. The leather binding of Sir Godfrey's journal is worn thin in places not from age, but from the constant grip of a hand that no longer knew the weight of a sword. Once the proud castellan of Rochefort, he survived the siege that claimed his fortress only to find himself adrift in a world that measured a man's worth by the walls he commanded. His writings, preserved in a Toulouse archive, read like a map of a soul unraveling. Today I took coin from a merchant to guard his wagons. One entry begins, the ink blotted as if the quill had trembled. The same man who once bowed to me in my own hall now counts my wage like I'm some common cutpurse. What makes Godfrey's account so harrowing isn't just the loss of status, but the way it gnawed at the very code he'd built his life upon. Chivalry's grand ideals, loyalty, fealty, martial prowess, meant nothing when his liege lord abandoned him to creditors. Pages oscillate between brittle defiance and raw humiliation. He describes polishing another knight's armor while fighting the urge to drive his dagger between the man's ribs. Later, he recounts vomiting after his first mercenary kill, not from guilt, but because the dead man's boots were finer than his own. The journal becomes a mirror for medieval honor's cruel paradox. The system that elevated knights also left them with no language for failure. Modern veterans' memoirs echo this dissonance with eerie precision. Like Godfrey, many soldiers describe returning from war to find their skills irrelevant, their sacrifices invisible in a world that moved on. A 12th century knight and a 21st century infantryman might weep over the same unanswerable question. When the battle that defined you becomes a footnote in someone else's ledger, who are you supposed to be? Yet Godfrey's deepest anguish wasn't material, it was spatial. Without his castle's physical boundaries, he lost the rituals that had structured his days. His journal fixates on small absences, no dawn inspection of the garrison, no evening walk along the battlements to watch the sunset dye the fields gold. Psychologists call this habit dislocation, where the loss of routine becomes its own trauma. For months, he woke at the same hour to make rounds, only to remember his chambers were now a roadside ditch. The body, it seems, remembers what the mind struggles to accept. The most poignant entries come later, when hunger forced him to sell his journal's vellum pages for bread. What remains are fragments, half-sentences about the taste of stolen apples, a child's laughter that reminded him of his lost daughter, the way beggars avoided his gaze because the stink of dead honor still clings to me. These scattered words hint at something profound. Even in freefall, he couldn't stop trying to document his own unraveling, as if the act of writing might reassemble the man the world had shattered. Archaeologists found his final relic not in an archive, but in a Marseille pawnshop's ledger from 1423, one rusted sword pommel exchanged for a wool cloak. The clerk's notation reads simply, "From a knight who wept." That pommel now sits in a museum case, its nicks and stains bearing silent witness to a truth we're only beginning to articulate: that displacement isn't just about losing land or title, but about the slow erosion of the stories we tell ourselves to stay whole. Godfrey's tragedy wasn't that he fell from grace, but that he kept reaching for a ladder that no longer existed. The parchment crackled with the dry finality of a royal decree as the bailiff read aloud the judgment Lord Renaud de Chatelain's ancestral lands were forfeit, his claims dismissed for lack of proper seals. What the court records don't capture is the way his wife's fingers dug into her sleeves until the fabric tore, or how their steward later found him staring at the empty space where the family charter had hung for 200 years. Medieval legal systems were masterful at quantifying loss in terms of acreage and silver marks, but utterly blind to the unspoken currencies of memory and belonging. For every noble who lost a castle to war or debt, a dozen more watched their heritage evaporate in stuffy courtrooms where grief had no standing. Take the infamous case of the Comte de Foix versus the Crown of Aragon, a legal saga that dragged through 3 papal courts over 26 years. On paper, it was a dispute over toll rights and succession laws, but buried in the Count's private correspondence are glimpses of the human toll. His daughter's dowry chests gathering dust as suitors withdrew, the local priest refusing to bury his father in unconsecrated exile soil, even the way his hunting dogs refused to obey commands in rented quarters. The final judgment awarded him compensation for material damages, but how does one price the way a certain staircase creaked underfoot, or the ancestral portraits that would never watch over another generation? Bureaucracy weaponized time itself against the displaced. Legal loopholes required documents older than most living memories, a death blow for families whose archives had burned during sieges. The Beaumont heirs spent 14 years trying to prove their great-grandfather hadn't technically mortgaged a tower room, all while watching weeds split the courtyard stones. Petitioners often died before their cases concluded, their children inheriting not just the claim, but the corrosive hope that justice might still come. In Avignon, a clerk's marginal note on one such file reads simply, "Third generation of plaintiffs, still no resolution. The cruelty lay in the system's veneer of fairness." Courts provided meticulous inventories of lost tapestries and livestock, yet reduced chapel relics to one silver candlestick, slightly dented. A Burgundian widow's desperate plea to recover her children's birth chamber was logged as dispute over second-floor solar, east wing. This lexical alchemy transformed homes into real estate, heirlooms into chattel, and lifetimes of stewardship into columns of debits and credits. Even victories rang hollow, like when the D'Albret family won back their ruined castle, only to discover the new owners had stripped every reusable stone, leaving them lords of a ghost. Some turned the law's cold logic against itself. Dame Marguerite de Coucy, upon learning her appeal would take decades, commissioned illuminated manuscripts depicting her family's history with the castle as its beating heart. Presented as evidence of continuous habitation, these artworks secretly functioned as emotional affidavits. The vibrant miniatures showing laundresses singing in the yard, children chasing geese through the gatehouse, even the particular way ivy climbed the south wall. Her case still failed, but the manuscripts survived as defiant testimony that some losses defy parchment reckoning. The bitterest irony, these legal battles often perpetuated the very displacement they purported to address. Families liquidated remaining assets to pay notaries, sold last jewels to bribe clerks, and, in one heartbreaking case from Poitiers, sent their sole surviving son to law school only to see him killed in a brawl over courtroom seating. The system that promised restoration became another slow siege, its weapons not trebuchets but deferrals and filing fees. Modern property disputes echo this dynamic, where the fight to reclaim what's lost often consumes what little remains. Perhaps the most revealing artifacts are the personal items found tucked inside legal satchels: a pressed flower from a lost garden, a child's drawing of a tower, a single thread from a banner long since burned. These weren't evidence but compass needles trembling toward home. They whisper a truth no medieval court could acknowledge, that justice, when it ignores the soul's geography, is just another form of exile. The tutor's quill hovered over the parchment, uncertain how to describe the 7-year-old boy staring at the crumbling model of his birthright. Young Lord Thibault of Anjou should have been learning Latin conjugations, but instead, He'd spent the morning rearranging toy soldiers around a wooden castle missing its west tower, his small fingers tracing fractures in the miniature stones as if they might whisper their secrets. The tutor's surviving notes, preserved in a Rowan archive, paint a portrait of a child raised on absence. When asked to draw his home, he sketched not the abbey where we reside, but a great gatehouse he's never seen, copied from a stolen charter in his pillow. What makes Thibault's story so heartbreaking is how displacement warped his understanding of the world before he'd even grasped its shape. While other noble children memorized the boundaries of their flourishing estates, Thibault's geography lessons revolved around lawsuits over lands held by strangers. His arithmetic problems calculated hypothetical incomes from vineyards his family hadn't harvested in decades. Even his bedtime stories were laced with poison, well-meaning servants spinning tales of his ancestors' glory, unaware they were feeding the boy a feast of ghosts. Child psychologists examining these records recognize classic symptoms of what we now call ambiguous loss, the trauma of grieving something that still technically exists, but remains perpetually out of reach. The castle ruins themselves became a sort of phantom limb for Thibault. Though his guardians forbade visits to the contested site, adolescent account books show secret payments to messengers who brought him rubble, a mossy stone from the barracks, a shard of stained glass from the chapel. These fragments took on almost religious significance in his private rituals. A maid's testimony describes finding the teenage lord kneeling by his bed, arranging the stones in precise patterns while reciting ancestral names like prayers. Modern clinicians would identify this as magical thinking, an attempt to exert control over overwhelming helplessness through symbolic acts. As Thibault matured, his fixation curdled into something darker. Court chronicles from his disastrous coming-of-age feast describe how he demanded guests address him by titles he didn't legally hold, serving wine in tarnished cups engraved with his family crest. When challenged, he flew into rages, screaming about stolen tapestries none of his peers had ever seen. The more his advisors urged him to focus on present realities, marriage alliances, trade agreements, the deeper he retreated into the labyrinth of his family's past. By 20, he'd bankrupted his household, hiring heralds to document every historical slight, every inch of land ever held by his bloodline. The tragic irony. Thibault's obsession mirrored his enemies' indifference. While he spent years reconstructing his great-grandfather's falconry schedules, the rival family occupying his castle were modernizing its kitchens and hosting lucrative wool fairs. Legal archives show they occasionally sent him trivial payments, not out of guilt but because steady sums kept him litigious rather than militant. They understood what Thibault never could, that in the new economy, nostalgia was cheaper to placate than to confront. Perhaps the most revealing artifact is Thibault's own illuminated manuscript, begun at 14 and never completed. Amidst standard genealogical records, bizarre personal annotations erupt. Grandfather's favorite hound was white with black ears. Does the new lord keep its descendants? And the well in the inner courtyard supposedly never froze. Test this when reclaimed. These scribbles expose the cruel paradox of inherited loss. Thibault didn't just want his castle back. He wanted to slip into a life already lived, to inhabit memories that weren't his own. When he finally gained limited access to the ruins at 32, chroniclers recorded his bizarre behavior, measuring doorways with his arms, pressing his cheek against soot-stained walls, even tasting the mortar. To observers, it looked like madness, but anthropologists recognize these as sensory rituals, attempts to bypass broken oral histories and physically commune with the past. The castle's new owners watched in uneasy silence as this gaunt stranger paced the exact dimensions of rooms that existed only in his imagination. his boots scuffing the same flagstones where his ancestors had danced, fought, and died. Thibault's eventual downfall came not through battle, but through an act of poetic futility. He spent his last coins commissioning an absurdly detailed tapestry depicting the castle as it stood in his great-grandfather's time, down to the correct number of ducks in the moat. The weavers working from his manic sketches produced a masterpiece of wishful thinking, but when unfurled before potential backers, the reaction was pitying silence. The tapestry survives today, its vibrant threads mocking the grey ruins it sought to replace. In the end, Thibault didn't just lose his castle, he became a living monument to the dangers of loving a ghost. The salvaged cornerstone didn't fit perfectly in the new manor's foundation. The mason had to chip away at the surrounding mortar to make room for its uneven edges. But for Lady Allais de Breval, that imperfection was the whole point. This single weathered block, smuggled from her family's fallen castle under cover of fog, now anchored the hearth of a modest country house. Every morning, she'd run her fingers along its chisel marks, feeling the echo of a great hall that no longer stood. Across medieval Europe, these quiet acts of architectural rebellion unfolded as displaced families wove the bones of their lost castles into new homes, turning survival into an art form. The records of these rebuilders read like blueprints of defiance. In southern France, the exiled Lord of Montbrun constructed a fortified farmhouse using stones from his ancestral keep, each one numbered and placed according to their original positions in the castle walls. His great hall, though a quarter the size, featured the same distinctive pinkish limestone around the fireplace, ensuring every visitor recognized the provenance of his humility. Further north, a guild of displaced castle servants pooled their resources to build a communal longhouse with a roof supported by repurposed gatehouse hinges. These weren't just practical choices, they were declarations that identity could outlast destruction. Modern archaeologists have identified telltale signs of these emotional salvage operations. Certain manor foundations contain conspicuous patches of older masonry, their weathering patterns mismatched to the surrounding stone. At Château des Tours in Normandy, ground-penetrating radar revealed a curious anomaly beneath the wine cellar, a perfect circle of rubble arranged around nothing. Only when researchers cross-referenced medieval accounts did the truth emerge. The dispossessed builder had recreated the dimensions of his lost castle's well shaft, burying it like a time capsule beneath his new home's floors. The psychological impact of these hybrid structures was profound. Chroniclers noted how children raised in such houses developed uncanny knowledge of castles they'd never seen, instinctively avoiding certain walls or touching particular stones, behaviors their parents had never explicitly taught them. One physician's journal describes a noblewoman who recovered from a months-long melancholy only after being allowed to sleep with her cheek pressed against a salvaged chapel tile embedded in her bedchamber wall. The stones, it seemed, carried more than structural weight. They transmitted the intangible rhythms of a life that had once pulsed within them. Contemporary refugee communities echo this instinctual need to weave the past into present shelter. Syrian architects in exile have been documented mixing handfuls of homeland soil into concrete foundations. Ukrainian families displaced by war recreate their lost homes' layout in temporary housing, arranging donated furniture to mirror rooms that no longer exist. Like their medieval counterparts, these modern rebuilders understand that home isn't just about shelter, it's about continuity. When a Bosnian grandmother insists on hanging her front door at the exact same angle as her destroyed village house, or a Rohingya artist paints familiar floral patterns on a refugee camp's bamboo walls, they're practicing the same spatial alchemy as Lady Allais with her ill-fitting cornerstone. Perhaps the most poignant parallel lies in what these acts refuse to acknowledge. Neither medieval nobles nor modern refugees can realistically believe a salvaged brick or a handful of dirt will magically restore what was lost. Yet the stubbornness of the gesture itself becomes its own victory, proof that displacement doesn't have to mean erasure. When the Count of Foix built his new manor's staircase with alternating steps from his castle's grand stair, each uneven rise became a silent protest against oblivion. Every child who skinned their knee on those steps learned two histories simultaneously: where they came from and how far their family had carried that memory. These hybrid structures ultimately challenge our definitions of survival. We often picture medieval displacement ending in either triumphant reconquest or resigned assimilation, but the truth unfolded in subtler shades. A kitchen wall containing stones from a fallen keep's armory quietly redefined what victory looked like. A lintel carved with both the old coat of arms and the new owner's merchant mark became a bridge between worlds. Like scars that map personal history onto living skin, these architectural palimpsests bore witness to the most human of truths: that rebuilding isn't about replacing what was lost, but learning how to let what remains shape what comes next. The iron key bit into Sister Marguerite's palm as she knelt in the convent garden, its teeth pressing the same pattern into her skin that they once did into the lock of Chateau de Vexin's great gate. 30 years had passed since she'd last turned it, yet she still woke gasping from dreams where the metal grew warm in her hand, as if the castle itself were calling her home. The convent's archives preserve her story not in the neat Latin of official records, but in the margins of prayer books, tiny sketches of turrets hidden between psalms, inventories of lost tapestries scribbled behind hymns. Here, amid the scent of lavender and beeswax, this noblewoman turned nun waged her quiet war against oblivion. What makes Marguerite's defiance so remarkable is how she weaponized the very rituals meant to erase her past. While the abbess demanded strict adherence to the rule of Saint Benedict, Marguerite found loopholes in sacred silence. She arranged her few permitted possessions so the key always touched her rosary, forging a tangible link between prayer and memory. During weekly confession, she meticulously described the castle's chapel, not as idle reminiscence, but as theological instruction on proper devotional spaces. Even her needlework became subterfuge. The altar cloth she embroidered featured the castle's heraldic colors in subtle gradients, visible only when the morning sun struck the linen at a particular angle. Historians recently discovered her most audacious act hidden in plain sight. The convent's 15th century ledger lists a most peculiar bequest, a set of rusted keys to be displayed beside the reliquary every Easter. Cross-referencing with architectural records confirmed the truth. These weren't spiritual symbols, but the actual gate keys to Vexin, smuggled into the convent under Marguerite's robes. By sanctifying them as holy objects, she ensured future generations would handle them with reverence rather than discard them as junk. Modern conservators examining the keys found something astonishing: microscopic traces of skin cells and salt preserved in the corrosion, evidence of a lifetime's secret grip. Marguerite's story illuminates a broader truth about medieval convents as emotional refuges. Aristocratic women displaced by war or political upheaval often entered religious life not out of vocation but necessity. Behind cloister walls, they practiced subtle forms of remembrance that secular society would have deemed dangerous. The Abbey of Fontrevolt's archives contain recipe books where exiled noblewomen transcribed their castle kitchen's dishes as if they were sacred texts, instructions for almond milk posset written with the same care as scripture. At Los Huelgas in Spain, archaeologists uncovered floor tiles near the choir stalls bearing faint shoe scuffs in deliberate patterns, suggesting displaced nuns recreated the pacing paths of their lost homes during Vespers. The psychological toll of this dual existence surfaces in unexpected places. A 13th century psalter from Canterbury contains disturbing marginalia, a nun's sketch of her family castle slowly being consumed by inked flames, overlaid with prayers for deliverance. Medical treatises from the period describe melancholia of the cloistered, marked by sleepwalking to locked gates and trance-like recitations of ancestral lineages. Some nuns developed rituals so precise they bordered on magical thinking, like the sister at Fontevraud who washed her hands exactly 12 times daily, mirroring the number of steps from her childhood chamber to the castle's solar. Yet convents also offered something rare for displaced women, agency over their narratives. While chroniclers outside wrote triumphant accounts of fallen castles, nuns controlled their own scriptoriums. The magnificent Codex Rotundus, created by a noblewoman at Aachen, depicts her ancestral home not as a conquered ruin, but suspended in celestial light, an eternal vision untouched by temporal loss. Other manuscripts contain memory maps where convent gardens are labeled with castle place names, collapsing geography into a bearable fiction. Marguerite's final act of resistance came on her deathbed. According to the convent's necrology, she refused last rites until the keys were placed on her chest. As the priest protested this irregularity, she whispered words that still echo through displacement studies. "You worry these will keep me from heaven. They are my only heaven." The keys were buried with her, but their legacy lives on not as tools for locks long destroyed, but as proof that some bonds defy even the relentless grinding of time. When archaeologists excavated her grave centuries later, they found the iron completely oxidized, its shape preserved only by the roots of the lavender plant that had grown above it, as if the land itself had memorized what human hands could no longer hold. The villagers whispered of lights flickering in the ruins long after the last torch had been doused, of spectral banquets echoing through roofless halls. What began as raw grief, the shock of seeing one's home reduced to nesting grounds for ravens, slowly twisted into something stranger, softer. Over generations, the hard edges of displacement blurred into folklore. The castle wasn't gone, it had simply slipped into the realm of legend, where broken towers hid enchanted swords, and every shadow held a ghost story waiting to be told. This alchemy of memory didn't just preserve the past, it rewrote it, turning collective trauma into a language of wonder and warning. Take the tale of Chateau de Brissac's Green Lady, born from a real 15th century tragedy. Historical records mention a noblewoman strangled by her husband in a fit of jealousy, her body hastily entombed within the castle walls. But folk versions transformed her into something far more potent, a mournful spirit draped in emerald silk, forever pacing the moonlit battlements. Locals claimed she wasn't haunting the ruins so much as guarding them, her restless presence a bulwark against forgetting. The brilliance of this evolution lies in its emotional sleight of hand. A brutal murder became a story about eternal vigilance, allowing descendants to frame loss as loyalty that outlasted death itself. Folklore's greatest trick was its ability to democratize grief. While nobles commissioned chronicles to record their lineages, peasants spun tales where even the lowliest kitchen maid might become the hero. In the Pyrenees, ruins said to house the Weeping Sentinel turned out to be based on a real sentry, not some valiant knight, but a shepherd's son pressed into service who'd reportedly refused to abandon his post during a blizzard. Over centuries, his frozen corpse in the guard tower became a parable about duty, then a cautionary tale about pride, and finally a children's story where his ghost shared warm chestnuts with lost travelers. Each retelling sanded down the horror, making the unbearable bearable. The treasure legends reveal even more about this coping mechanism. Nearly every ruined castle boasts tales of hidden gold, but folklorists spot telling patterns. In regions where displacement came through sudden violence, stories describe cursed hordes guarded by skeletal warriors. Where financial ruin toppled dynasties, the treasure is often comic, like the chest of endless salt, said to lie beneath Dunluce Castle, mocking the lord who taxed salt so heavily it bankrupted his tenants. These narratives didn't just romanticize loss, they reframed it as cosmic justice or moral lesson, giving chaos meaning. Modern psychology recognizes this as narrative reconstruction, the brain's way of stitching rawness into coherence. But medieval people didn't need clinical terms to understand the balm of storytelling. When a Welsh bard sang of castle-wide dregs, sleeping dragons, he wasn't denying the castle's destruction by English forces. He was offering his audience a secret victory, the idea that what was lost might merely be dormant, waiting for the right moment to rise again. This wasn't escapism, it was emotional armor. The darkest legends, though, are the ones that refused to soften. In the Scottish Highlands, certain ruins remained stubbornly absent from local lore, no romantic hauntings, no whimsical treasure maps. Archaeologists eventually realized these were castles whose fall had severed communal bonds so completely that even memory couldn't salvage them. The silence speaks volumes. Some wounds resist the salve of myth. Yet even there, you'll find traces of resistance. A Gaelic lullaby from Skye mentions the stones that no song can warm. Its melody so haunting it somehow memorializes the forgetting itself. What makes these folk traditions so powerful is their duality. They functioned as both comfort and resistance, a way to mourn while slyly insisting the conquerors hadn't truly won. Every ghost story whispered in a tavern, every child's game played amid the rubble was an act of quiet defiance. The castles might belong to history, but their stories, those still belong to the people. And as long as someone could still tell of the white stag that appeared whenever a true heir approached the ruins of Château de Sang, or describe the exact hour when the phantom bells of Clonmacnoise rang for a vanished world, then in some essential way the stones had never fallen at all. The merchant's quill hovered over the ledger where crisp new numbers marched in perfect rows, so many barrels of wine sold, so many bolts of Flemish cloth traded, all leading to the sum that had bought him the crumbling silhouette on the hill. Jean-Baptiste Fournier should have been triumphant. He'd done what no commoner in living memory had achieved, purchased Château de Versailles not for its lands or rents, but for the sheer weight of its history. Yet his diary entry from that first night tells a different story. The servants whisper behind their hands when they think I cannot hear, he wrote, ink blotting the page as if his hand had trembled. They call me the heron for how I stalk these empty halls, all legs and beak, pecking at crumbs of a feast I was never invited to. What makes Jean-Baptiste's plight so poignant is how perfectly it mirrors the very nobility who'd scorned him. Like them, he'd fallen under the castle's spell, believing stone and mortar could transmute coin into legacy, but the locals refused to play their part in this alchemy. Village women crossed themselves when he passed, muttering about the merchant who bought a ghost. The few remaining castle servants, those too old or stubborn to leave, followed his orders with glacial precision, never quite meeting his eyes. Even the children's games outside the walls took on a sinister edge, their rhymes about the counting man who sleeps in dead men's beds, carrying clearly through the broken windows. His meticulously kept household accounts reveal the depth of this alienation. Pages detail extravagant repairs, imported Italian tiles for the chapel floor, German glass for the solar windows, alongside increasingly desperate entries like paid the cooper double wages to stay and ordered another ton of claret, though last remains untouched. The castle was physically reviving, yet it remained emotionally hollow. Historians recently uncovered his most telling purchase, 1,200 livres spent on a genealogist to fabricate noble ancestry. a project abandoned when the man confessed even forged parchments wouldn't make the stones recognize him. Modern sociologists spot uncanny parallels in gentrified neighborhoods from Brooklyn to Berlin. Like Jean-Baptiste, affluent newcomers often mistake possession for belonging, pouring money into restoring brownstones or tenements while remaining perpetual outsiders to the communities that once thrived there. The same dynamics play out: local tradesmen charging stranger prices, long-time residents withholding oral histories, children's sidewalk chalk mapping invisible boundaries no deed can erase. Displacement, it seems, isn't just about who loses a home, but about who fails to inherit its soul. Yet Jean-Baptiste's story takes an unexpected turn. Buried in his later journals are hints of a quiet surrender. He stops fighting the castle's whispers and starts listening. Entries shift from ledgers to observations: how the morning light strikes the northeast tower at midsummer, the exact pitch of the wind through a particular arrow loop, even the ancestral rose varieties he discovered struggling in the overgrown gardens. Without realizing it, he began learning the castle's language not as an owner, but as a student. His final diary rests open in a Dijon museum, its last page bearing a child's crude drawing of the chateau labeled "Our House" in shaky letters. Turns out the Cooper's granddaughter had gifted it to him after he taught her to read using the castle's old heraldry as alphabet lessons. That simple act, passing the castle's stories to someone who could carry them forward, finally bridged the gap no gold could cross. The drawing's survival suggests Jean-Baptiste understood this fragile victory. Beneath it, his final written words: "Today, for the first time, the stones did not feel cold." The monastery's scriptorium smelled of vellum and beeswax as Brother Anselm dipped his quill into ink the color of dried blood. His task was sacred, though no bishop had commissioned it, to record not scripture, but the names of every family displaced when Chateau de Montfort fell. Line after meticulous line, he inscribed their losses in an illuminated manuscript that would never grace an altar: Jehan the falconer, who buried his gloves beneath the mews; Marie of the kitchens, who took one brick from the hearth; Widow Hayleries, who wove her husband's surcoat into her cloak. In a world where conquerors wrote history, these pages became something radical, a testament that grief, too, was worthy of preservation. The Church's role in medieval displacement was paradoxical. While abbots sometimes blessed the armies that shattered castles, monasteries also became sanctuaries for the shards left behind. Unlike secular chronicles that glorified victors, religious manuscripts often captured the intimate wreckage: a knight's daughter donating her doll to a convent's relic collection, a steward's ledger annotated with psalms beside each unpaid debt. These artifacts didn't just document loss, they sanctified it, framing suffering as a spiritual trial rather than meaningless chaos. A stunning example survives in Salzburg's archives: a psalter where the usual gold leaf illuminations are replaced with minuscule drawings of a ruined castle's layout, each tower labeled with the names of those who once lived there. The monk who created it clearly understood that memory, too, could be a form of prayer. Theological writings from the period reveal how clergy wrestled with displacement's moral weight. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux famously compared exiled nobles to Job, their material losses a divine test of faith. But village priests offered simpler comforts, telling flocks that Christ himself had been a man without a castle, his homelessness redeeming their own. This dichotomy between high theology and grassroots solace shaped medieval coping mechanisms in profound ways. While bishops preached sermons on detachment from earthly things, local monks quietly tended herb gardens with plants from displaced families' former homes, preserving flavors that evoked memory as powerfully as any scripture. Modern psychologists note striking parallels between medieval spiritual coping and contemporary trauma therapy. the illuminated manuscripts functioned much like today's narrative exposure therapy, where survivors reconstruct painful memories into coherent stories. The ritual of inscribing losses mirrored cognitive behavioral techniques externalizing grief by giving it tangible form. Even the reliquary cults, where displaced families donated personal items to churches, find echoes in modern memorial quilts or roadside shrines. Both eras recognize the same truth: healing begins when pain is witnessed, not silenced. Yet crucial differences emerge. Medieval Christianity framed suffering as inevitable, a prelude to heavenly reward. Modern trauma care emphasizes agency and recovery, not passive endurance. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas might interpret a nobleman's downfall as divine chastisement for pride, while today's counselors would focus on rebuilding self-worth amid loss. This contrast surfaces vividly in personal accounts. Compare the tear-stained confession of Lord Durand, who scourged himself nightly for failing to defend his castle, with journals from contemporary refugees, who more often express anger at systemic injustice than guilt over their circumstances. The most poignant fusion of medieval and modern healing lies in unexpected places. At Mont Saint-Michel, archaeologists recently uncovered a 12th century pilgrim's badge depicting not a saint, but a ruined tower with the inscription, "Here too, God waits." Nearby, they found a modern counterpart, a displaced Syrian child's drawing of bombed Aleppo apartments, tucked beside the medieval relic as if across 8 centuries, two broken worlds had recognized each other. In that silent dialogue between artifacts, we glimpse the timeless human need to transform ruins into sanctuaries and grief into something that might, against all odds, still hold meaning. The ink had barely dried on Brother Martin's triumphant chronicle of Duke Henry's conquest when the first refugees arrived at his monastery gate. His own words, flowery descriptions of banners snapping victoriously over Chateau Dolores's shattered gates, clanged in his memory as he watched a gray-haired woman press her forehead against the abbey's reliquary, her whispered confession chilling. "I buried my daughter's doll in the chapel ruins before they marched us out." Martin's quill, so swift to praise military strategy days earlier, now hovered over his finished manuscript like a guilty thing. No one witnessed the moment he scratched 2 jagged Latin words in the margin: "Mentitus sum, I lied." This tiny act of defiance, preserved by chance in a Lyon archive, cracks open a hidden dimension of medieval displacement, not just the loss of homes but the theft of their stories. Chroniclers like Martin were the era's journalists, their scrolls shaping how future generations would remember conquests. The official account of Loris's fall reads like a chess match: troop movements, breached walls, the Duke's merciful treatment of surrendered nobles. What's missing? The baker who jumped from the ramparts clutching his crippled son, the laundress who later died clutching a scrap of the lady's torn gown, the way the castle cats reportedly howled for weeks in the abandoned kitchens. Martin's belated marginalia admits a devastating truth: history isn't just written by victors, but edited by the ashamed. The psychology behind his confession reveals itself in layers. Earlier in the same manuscript, careful readers can spot subtle rebellions, a description of the Duke's tent embroidered with gold thread from Bruges, a known hub of usurers, or how the scribe accidentally records the conquering army's camp followers outnumbering actual soldiers. These weren't errors, but breadcrumbs leading to uncomfortable truths. Modern forensic analysis shows his ink changed composition when writing certain passages, suggesting pauses where he dipped his quill in watered-down pigment, as if hesitating to commit darker details to permanence. Martin's crisis mirrors dilemmas faced by modern documentarians covering war zones, like a photographer angling shots to protect refugees' dignity or a journalist omitting a village name to deter looters. medieval scribes balanced truth against consequence. A recently discovered letter from his abbot chides Martin for excessive sympathy toward displaced families, ordering him to focus on the duke's divinely ordained triumph. The scribe's solution was ingenious. He obeyed while smuggling uncomfortable truths into supply inventories. A list of plundered church goods includes an aside about stolen altar cloths, still bearing creases from the Lady Isabel's kneeling. Grain records note stores sufficient for 300 souls, though none remained to eat it. These buried ledgers became his real chronicle. The aftermath of his confession is equally telling. Martin spent his final years compiling a census of Loris's former residents, not their titles or wealth, but their trades and habits. Gilles the farrier could mend any shoe without removing it from the hoof, reads one entry. Little Jean knew where the sweetest wild strawberries grew near the postern gate. This quiet project, ignored in his lifetime, survives as one of history's most moving reparations, an attempt to restore not land or treasure, but the texture of lives erased from official memory. What makes Martin's story resonate today is how it implicates us all in displacement's aftermath. Every time we uncritically repeat heroic conquest narratives, every time we prioritize architectural blueprints over human stories in preservation efforts, we become complicit in the same silencing he regretted. His trembling marginalia challenges us to ask whose voices are missing from our history books, our museum plaques, even our travel vlogs about picturesque ruins. Those crumbled towers aren't just relics of the past, they're tombstones for stories we've yet to fully exhume. Archaeologists working at Loris recently made an astonishing discovery. Beneath the chapel's foundation, they found a child-sized hollow containing a moldering cloth doll and a scrap of vellum with 4 words, "Martin, you were kind." Whether the scribe ever knew his secret census reached its subjects remains unknown. But in that dank pit, 5 centuries later, his pen finally achieved what his duke's sword never could: a reunion. The paperwork arrived in a crisp government envelope, its bureaucratic font declaring the impossible after 8 generations. The estate taxes had finally outpaced the family's ability to hold on. For Elena Whitcomb, reading that notice in her grandmother's sitting room felt eerily like the medieval accounts she'd studied in grad school. The chipped teacup trembled in her hands, its floral pattern matching the wallpaper chosen in 1892, when her ancestors still believed their ivy-covered mansion would stand forever. It wasn't just losing the house, she confessed later, running her fingers over a water stain shaped like Italy on the library ceiling. It was realizing I'd been the caretaker of a future that wouldn't exist. Her story isn't unique. Across the globe, modern heirs grapple with versions of the same devastation medieval nobles faced: the slow unraveling of legacy under the weight of changing economies. In England, stately homes now host corporate retreats to cover inheritance taxes, their ballrooms echoing with team-building exercises instead of waltzes. Japanese noble ruins stand abandoned as descendants choose urban careers over maintaining ancestral estates. Even in America, where history stretches shorter, families like the Vanderbilts watch their castles become museums, their private histories now public exhibits. The emotional blueprint remains startlingly consistent: grief for places that were never just buildings, but the physical containers of identity. Developers wielding contracts instead of siege engines create their own brand of displacement. A Bangkok neighborhood's eviction notices might as well have been medieval decrees when elderly residents salvaged door handles from their demolished shophouses, mirroring Lady Alea's smuggled cornerstone. In Rio's favelas, community murals painted on soon-to-be bulldozed walls serve the same purpose as Henry the Minstrel's ballads. a defiant insistence that these stories won't vanish quietly. The technology has changed, but the human response remains rooted in that primal need to say, "We existed here, this place mattered." Psychologists identify a phenomenon they call generational place attachment, where trauma embeds itself in familial memory across centuries. Descendants of Scottish clans cleared from their lands during the 18th century, enclosures still report visceral reactions to certain landscapes. A Montreal study found third-generation immigrants unconsciously replicating their ancestors' village layouts in backyard gardens. Like Thibault of Anjou rearranging his rubble fragments, these modern descendants engage in what researchers term symbolic reconstitution, piecing together identity from whatever fragments remain. The legal battles mirror medieval disputes with uncanny precision. A current lawsuit over a Hudson Valley mansion hinges on interpreting an 1843 will's archaic phrasing about heirs male of the body, language lifted straight from feudal succession laws. Wealthy families now employ legacy consultants who function like modern-day heralds, documenting bloodlines to protect against inheritance challenges. Meanwhile, tax codes have become the new divine right of kings, an implacable force that reshapes dynasties regardless of personal merit or sacrifice. Yet amid these parallels glimmer pockets of reinvention. Just as medieval convents preserved memory through subversive embroidery, a group of displaced Detroit homeowners created an oral history quilt stitched with addresses and childhood memories. The descendants of Charleston's enslaved gardeners now lead tours through plantations, reclaiming narratives their ancestors were forced to cultivate. And in a Tokyo skyscraper's lobby, the reconstructed gate of a demolished samurai estate stands not as a relic, but as a touchstone for employees seeking connection in a glass and steel landscape. Perhaps the most profound lesson from these modern echoes lies in their collective refusal to let loss be the final word. When a fire ravaged Notre Dame, the world didn't just mourn the architecture, we ached for the labyrinth of personal stories those stones held. That reaction proves something essential. 800 years after the fall of Chateau de Breval, we still understand castles the way Henry the Minstrel did. Not as property or status, but as the physical embodiment of our most fragile, enduring truth, that every life leaves fingerprints on the world, and those marks deserve to be remembered, whether they're pressed into medieval mortar or the peeling paint of a Brooklyn brownstone. The trowel scraped against something that wasn't stone, a high, hollow sound that made Dr. Clara Vosfries mid-motion, brushing away centuries of compacted soil. Her fingers closed around a tiny wooden horse, its paint faded but still clinging stubbornly to the grooves of its carved mane. It should have been just another artifact, catalogued and bagged like the hundreds before it, but as she turned it in the morning light, something about the way its left ear was chipped, an imperfection too specific to be coincidence, sent a shock through her. Her grandmother's stories rushed back, a Bavarian castle, a little girl fleeing with only her favorite toy, that same horse missing its ear after a fall from a nursery windowsill. Clara's clipboard slipped from her grasp, scattering paperwork across the excavation grid. All these years meticulously separating personal bias from professional observation, and here history had ambushed her with a fragment of her own bloodline. The castle ruins surrounding her were no longer just a research site. They were the skeletal remains of a home her family had been torn from during the 30 Years' War. Suddenly, the child's skeleton uncovered last week wasn't just burial 12. It might have been a playmate of her many greats-grandmother. The bread oven's soot patterns weren't merely data points. They preserved the fingerprints of relatives who'd kneaded dough where she now knelt with her measuring tape. Archaeology thrives on detachment, the belief that layers of soil can be peeled back like anonymous pages. But as Clara stared at the toy, she realized every shard of pottery she'd ever handled carried this same invisible weight. That broken jug wasn't just evidence of trade routes. It was someone's wedding gift shattered during a siege. The arrowheads in the armory weren't mere military hardware. They'd been polished daily by an armorer who probably hummed the same lullaby Clara's grandmother had sung to her. The discipline's great unspoken lie crumbled like mortar under her fingertips. No one studies ruins from neutral ground. Her team noticed the change. Where Clara used to photograph wall foundations with clinical precision, she now caught herself imagining which shadows had fallen where a child might have napped. The spreadsheet columns for artifact condition grew handwritten addenda, handle lightly, glue along seam fragile on a doll's leg, sun exposure likely faded blue pigment on a toy soldier's coat. Her colleagues whispered about breached protocols, but Clara understood something academia rarely admitted. True preservation begins when we recognize ourselves in the fragments. The revelation rippled beyond her dig site. Re-examining archives, she found traces of other archaeologists' blind spots. A 19th century excavator who'd sketched a particular style of hearth identical to his own childhood homes. A post-war researcher who'd focused obsessively on military artifacts after losing his brother in the Blitz. Even the vaunted stratigraphy diagrams they all relied upon carried silent biases. What got labeled significant versus debris often depended on whose ancestors built what. By season's end, Clara had instituted a radical new practice at her digs. Beside every trench, she placed a blank journal titled, "The Things We Carry." Team members were encouraged to record not just measurements, but the memories artifacts sparked. A comb's teeth recalling a mother's braid, a gaming piece reminding someone of their grandfather's backgammon lessons. At first dismissed as sentimental, the journal soon revealed unexpected insights. One volunteer's note about how a spoon's worn edge matched her toddler's grip led to realizing the castle's nursery had been misidentified as a pantry for decades. On her final day at the site, Clara didn't submit the wooden horse to the university's collection. She placed it in her pocket, next to the photo of her grandmother she'd kept folded in her field notebook all season. The ethical breach would haunt her, but so would this truth. Sometimes the most important thing we excavate isn't what lies buried in the earth, but what surfaces in ourselves when we acknowledge that every ruin was once someone's morning sunlight through a leaded window, someone's footsteps echoing down a now collapsed corridor. Science demands we separate observer from subject, but history whispers that the separation was always fiction. The clash of wooden swords rings out across the field, but the man playing the defeated castellan isn't just acting, he's channeling 24 generations of silence. Meet Colin McAllister, a Glasgow IT specialist by weekday, but on summer weekends, the man who dons a replica of his ancestors' surcoat to relive the very moment their clan lost Dunconnor Castle in 1582. The first time I shouted "Hold the gate" in that reenactment, he admits, voice cracking, I felt something unclench in my chest that I didn't even know was tight. What looks like hobbyist theater to outsiders is, for participants like Colin, something far deeper, a communal exorcism of inherited grief, played out with historically accurate props. Psychologists studying these groups have identified a phenomenon they call embodied memory resolution. When descendants physically reconstruct ancestral traumas, whether holding a crumbling family charter during a siege reenactment or grinding flour in a reconstructed castle kitchen, their brains process the events as first-hand experiences rather than abstract history. Dr. Elissa Petronovic's groundbreaking study tracked cortisol levels in participants during events, revealing a startling pattern. While stress hormones spiked during battle scenarios, they plummeted to below baseline levels afterward. mirroring the biochemical release seen in modern trauma therapy. It's as if the body finally convinces the mind, we survived this, it's over now, she explains. The rituals vary as widely as the wounds they address. In Normandy, the annual reenactment of Château de Falaise's surrender includes a quiet addendum. Descendants of both besiegers and besieged share a meal in the ruins afterward, using recipes from the castle's last intact ledger. Over stew made from 12th century instructions, arguments about historical grievances give way to laughter over how badly everyone pronounces Old French. Meanwhile, at Hungary's Eger Castle, women whose ancestors fled the Ottoman siege now demonstrate reconstructed herbal remedies in the exact chambers where their foremothers once nursed the wounded, turning sites of trauma into spaces of reclaimed expertise. Some of the most profound healing occurs off-script. During a Welsh reenactment of Harlech Castle's fall, a participant playing an exiled noblewoman broke character entirely when a local child handed her a daisy chain, a gesture not in the script, but one that mirrored a family legend about her ancestors' final moments there. That kid had no way of knowing, she later told oral historians. But in our stories, the last thing my many times great-grandmother saw was the wildflowers growing through the cracks as they dragged her out. These unplanned moments of grace, what researchers term historical serendipity, often prove more therapeutic than the meticulously planned battles. Critics dismiss such events as romanticized nostalgia, but the participants' lived experiences tell a different story. A Lithuanian group reenacting the Teutonic siege of Pilny Castle incorporates an unusual element after the mass suicide scene. Based on the legend of defenders choosing death over surrender, they host a shadow puppet show for children using the historical figures' names. We're not just rehearsing the pain, explains organizer Rossa Meinelgate. We're teaching the next generation how to carry it without being crushed. This intergenerational approach mirrors cutting-edge family therapy techniques, where traumatic narratives are reshaped into stories of resilience. The artifacts emerging from these groups reveal their transformative power. In York, a chest in the Guildhall holds what locals call the unsent letters, notes written by reenactors to ancestors and left in castle ruins during ceremonies. Some thank forebears for their sacrifices, others express forgiveness for perceived failures. I don't blame you for surrendering, the crops were failing. One, written by a teenager descended from both Norman conquerors and Saxon defenders, simply reads, "I'll remember you both." These fragile papers, never meant for public viewing, may prove to future historians what modern brain scans already suggest. That sometimes healing history requires not just studying the past, but physically stepping into its shoes, if only for a weekend. The rain had stopped just before dawn, leaving the ruins of Château de Veyrac glistening under a hesitant sun. Amid the usual crowd of guidebook-toting tourists and chattering school groups, one woman stood unnaturally still. Claire Duval had never set foot in France before this vacation, yet as she traced her fingers along the chapel's broken arch, her breath caught with a sorrow that defied explanation. It felt like walking into a room where someone had just been crying. She'd later tell researchers, unable to articulate why she'd spent 40 minutes weeping in the roofless Great Hall, her palms pressed against stones still damp from the storm. The castle caretaker, accustomed to emotional visitors, made an offhand note in the guestbook until Claire returned the next day with a local genealogist, clutching census records showing her maternal line descended directly from the Veyrac family, exiled in 1632 after refusing to surrender to royal troops. What Claire experienced wasn't just déjà vu. Every turn through the ruins had sparked visceral reactions, a racing heartbeat near the northeast tower where family lore said a child had fallen, an overwhelming scent of lavender near the herb garden's long-vanished beds. When shown a reconstructed portrait of the castle's last lady, she recognized the distinctive widow's peak mirrored in her own reflection. Skeptics dismissed it as confirmation bias, but neuroscientists took notice. Dr. Livia Men's team at the University of Coimbra conducted MRI scans while Claire viewed images of Veyrac versus unrelated castles. Only Veyrac's layout triggered her amygdala's primal memory centers, alongside a spike in theta waves typically seen during autobiographical recall. Her brain reacted as if these ruins were her childhood home, Men's reported. Despite zero conscious exposure, historians counter with simpler explanations. The Veyrac's exile had been brutal forced marches, confiscated heirlooms, infants buried by roadsides. Such trauma leaves marks beyond genetics. Family diaries described generations teaching children the castle's layout through embroidered maps and songs listing every storeroom and stair. Claire's great-grandmother's recipe book included odd marginal sketches of a tower not matching any near their Quebec farmhouse, an architectural heirloom preserved through ink and instinct. This folk memory, passed through bedtime stories and half-remembered traditions, might explain her bodily recognition better than any pseudoscientific notion of ancestral recall. Yet other cases defy even this rationale. In Wales, a Texan engineer correctly identified the overgrown location of Castle Conedaw's secret postern gate before archaeologists uncovered it, despite no surviving blueprints. Genetic testing later revealed his patrilineal line descended from the castle's last constable. More chillingly, he described the gate's wooden hinges, a detail only found in a single scorched parchment the family had smuggled into exile. Psychologist Dr. Ethan Cole proposes these aren't memories, but inherited trauma responses, epigenetic changes from displacement altering how descendants process spatial awareness and loss. The body remembers what the mind never knew, he argues, pointing to similar findings in Holocaust descendants' stress reactions. The debate rages, but perhaps the truth lies somewhere between science and poetry. When Claire later stood in the castle's overgrown rose garden, a caretaker's shovel struck metal, a rusted locket containing a miniature of a woman whose eyes mirrored Claire's own. Inside, folded thinner than onion skin, was a child's drawing of the castle labeled Pour Marfil in trembling script, the date 1631, the year before exile. Coincidence can't explain why Claire, unprompted, hummed a lullaby matching the one handwritten on the drawing's reverse, a melody her Montreal-born mother had sung, claiming it came from the old country. Science may never prove genetic memory exists, but in that sun-dappled ruin, centuries collapsed like folds in time, leaving only the certainty that some bonds outlast even stone. The debate over whether to restore a ruined castle or let its broken walls stand as they are isn't just about bricks and mortar, it's a battleground for memory itself. On one side, preservationists argue that every reconstructed stone is a stitch in time, mending the fabric of history for future generations. On the other, purists insist that ruins should remain untouched, their fractures telling a story no polished replica ever could. The tension between these views mirrors the very conflicts that reduced these castles to rubble in the first place, the clash between holding on and moving forward. Take the ongoing controversy at Château de Montalembert in France, where a billionaire's proposal to fully restore the castle sparked protests from descendants of the original family. They argue that rebuilding the towers would erase the scars of the revolution, the bullet marks on the courtyard walls, the soot stains from the fire that forced their ancestors to flee. Yet local tradespeople counter that restoration would breathe life back into a dying region, providing jobs and reviving lost crafts like medieval lime mortar mixing. The conflict exposes an uncomfortable truth. preservation isn't just about the past, it's about who gets to control the narrative of loss and renewal. Archaeologists often find themselves caught in the crossfire. At Dunstanburgh Castle in England, a team discovered that stabilizing one crumbling wall would require dismantling another section, a literal choice between which parts of history survive. Their solution, a compromise that left the most emotionally significant areas like the guardroom where displaced families scratched their names, untouched, while reinforcing structurally critical sections with reversible techniques. This approach, known as living conservation, acknowledges that ruins aren't frozen in time but evolving artifacts, still shaping lives centuries after their abandonment. Developers, however, face harsher scrutiny. When a Spanish hotel chain proposed converting Castillo de Belmont into luxury suites, outrage erupted over plans to repaint frescoes and install modern plumbing in the chapel. Critics accused them of disnifying trauma, turning a site of siege and starvation into a backdrop for champagne toasts. Yet the company's historical consultant, herself a descendant of Jewish refugees who sheltered there during the Inquisition, made a compelling case. Is it worse to alter a building or to let it crumble into oblivion because we've priced memory beyond reach? The ethical lines blur further with digital reconstruction. Laser scans and VR now allow visitors to experience castles as they once were walking through digitally recreated halls while standing amid real ruins. Purists argue this sanitizes history, divorcing it from the physical weight of decay. But for wheelchair users like historian Dr. Ian Chen, who could never navigate uneven rubble, these technologies offer inclusion. I finally understood why my ancestors fought so hard for this place when I saw the afternoon light stream through virtual stained glass exactly as they described in letters. Perhaps the most poignant perspective comes from communities who have lived in castles' shadows for generations. In the Scottish Highlands, locals near Donan fought not against restoration, but for the right to keep its 20th century additions, the bridge and visitor center that made the ruin accessible to them after centuries of aristocratic exclusion. Their protest banners said it all: our memories matter too. This raises the ultimate question: when we preserve a castle, whose story are we really saving? The answer, like the ruins themselves, is rarely simple, built layer upon contested layer. The debate won't be settled by historians or developers, but by the quiet persistence of the stones themselves. At Chateau de Cousy, where the German army dynamited the towers in 1917, a single gargoyle survived, its mocking grin now displayed in a museum far from the ruins. Some say it's a relic, others call it a hostage. Maybe it's both, proof that every act of preservation is also an act of interpretation, and that no matter how carefully we try to freeze the past, it keeps slipping through our fingers like sand between mortar. The stones may have crumbled, but the echoes linger not just in castle ruins scattered across windswept hills, but in the quiet ways we still reach for home across centuries. These medieval stories of displacement reveal a truth far deeper than broken mortar and fallen towers. Castles weren't just fortresses, but living tapestries woven from countless ordinary lives. Every chipped toy buried in rubble, every initial carved into a beam, every recipe passed down with the footnote, "As we made it in the castle kitchens," whispers the same refrain. What we lose when home is torn away isn't just walls, but the invisible threads connecting past to present, memory to meaning. Modern parallels surround us. The Syrian grandmother kneading dough with the same rhythm her mother taught her in Aleppo's courtyard. The Ukrainian child drawing pictures of her apartment building now reduced to ash. Even the subtle weight in a Detroit native's voice when they describe the scent of their childhood porch. These are all variations on the same human story medieval nobles and servants understood too well. The scale of loss differs, but the emotional blueprint remains. Displacement doesn't just erase addresses, it unravels the very fabric of how we understand who we are. Yet within these stories lies a defiant spark. When Lady Allay smuggled her cornerstone or Henry the Minstrel turned grief into ballads, they weren't just clinging to the past, they were rewriting the rules of survival. Their creativity whispers to us across time. Memory isn't passive, but something we actively shape and carry. Today's descendants stitching family crests into quilts, or refugees planting homeland flowers in foreign soil, prove this instinct transcends eras. The methods evolve, but the heart of the act remains unchanged, a refusal to let destruction have the final word. This is why ruins still draw us. When we walk through roofless halls tracing finger shadows where tapestries once hung, we're not just tourists admiring antiquity. We're pilgrims at an altar of resilience, bearing witness to the stubborn truth that every fallen castle still stands in some corner of the human spirit. The crumbled archways become mirrors, asking what fragments we'd clutch if our own homes were lost, and what fragile, beautiful things we might rebuild from them. So let these stories be more than history, let them be invitations. Share your family's tales of homes left behind, whether a grandparent's village, a childhood neighborhood now gentrified, or even a beloved treehouse lost to time. Post them below, whisper them to children, tuck them into recipe margins, because every time we pass these memories forward, we do what medieval survivors could only dream of. We make time itself the ally, not the thief. The castles may be gone, but the hands that built them, their legacy is ours to carry, not as burden, but as